People should have the article which was handed out called "The Fish Stinks from the Head." And I would encourage you to read it. There's a lot of details in there, but a couple basic points I really want to make, because if you remember the so-called Guccifer2 hack of the DNC server, which, do you realize no one has yet proven anything? There has been no evidence submitted that the Russians hacked the DNC, excepting this firm CrowdStrike, which is not a federal investigative body, said that it did. And as Donald Trump said correctly, the DNC server was never even turned over to the FBI. Not that I would trust the FBI, but nonetheless, it hasn't even been turned over to them. But that was, I think, June or July of 2016. And what is now known is that John Brennan, former CIA director, was in London meeting with the GCHQ, which is their clearinghouse intelligence agency, as early as November of 2015. Okay, so what you had, and what is becoming more and more documented, is a very close collaboration between the British intelligence, specifically the MI6, which the former head was Sir Richard Dearlove. His employee, quote unquote former employee, I don't know, I think it's sort of like the CIA. I don't see how you're really former, because unless you're fired, like Andrew McCabe, who apparently did lose his security clearance, but you still keep your security clearance and so on. So the former MI6 agent Christopher Steele was employed by Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the one who authored the dossier in 2003 on the so-called Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, which did not exist, which President Trump has referenced over and over again, that this war was based on a total fraud. Christopher Steele, as you know, was the author of this lying piece of crap 30-page dossier about President Trump, which was presented to him by the head of the FBI, Comey, then head of the FBI. And Comey himself said, and this gets me to, you can go to the, oh, I have it, right? Where is it? Is it this one?
No, forward.
Oh, that's forward?
Yeah.
There we go. That's Shakespeare.
Right.
All right, you may have heard a quote from Shakespeare, "Murder, though it hath no tongue, will speak." Comey, in his attempt to blackmail President Trump with the dossier, actually said, "I'm having a Hoover moment." Now think about that. What did J. Edgar Hoover do when he wasn't traipsing around in fishnet stockings? He was recording things and using them to blackmail people. They tried to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide by sending him audio recordings of various indiscretions, shall we put it that way. So, in other words, Comey himself admitted what he was doing to try and blackmail and control President Trump, who has been very clear since before he got elected. And if you read things about him or his own writings, he has been very, very concerned since the days of President Reagan, when LaRouche was working with Ronald Reagan on the Strategic Defense Initiative, that it is better to not have a nuclear war. As Eisenhower said, the only thing worse than losing a nuclear war would be winning a nuclear war, because there's nothing left. And you have people alive today who are insane enough to think that there is such a thing as a limited nuclear war. They think you can play a chicken game with Russia. Now, if you think about the history of Russia, think about how Napoleon fared with Russia, think about what the Russians were prepared to sacrifice, 27 million people to defeat Adolf Hitler. You really think you're going to push them into a corner and blackmail them for a policy by threatening nuclear war. And what President Putin did last March, as people may know, is he announced that Russia has gone ahead and developed what LaRouche and Reagan were discussing in the 80s. Russia now has hypersonic missiles. They have missiles that are powered by nuclear energy. So if you know about the wonderful ship which was built in Camden, New Jersey, which was the first nuclear-powered freight vessel, and I forget how many times it traveled around the world on very little fuel. You have a nuclear-powered rocket with a nuclear missile. This thing can change direction. It can go super fast. Wait, do you want to just?
Yeah, on that missile that they developed,
Yeah.
it can't be shot down.
Right, because the anti-ballistic missile system is based on trajectories, right? There's a physics.
Right.
You launch something at a certain angle, it goes a certain speed. You have a defensive system, you can knock it out of the sky. If you have a nuclear-powered rocket, which can go however it wants to go, your anti-ballistic missile system, that is all this hardware that Obama and Bush, on behalf of the British, have installed on the borders of Russia against every agreement that Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev had when the Berlin Wall came down. That entire system is in effect obsolete. And that's what Putin was announcing. He also announced that Russia felt it necessary to do this not because they intend to start a war. He said, unlike the United States, Russia has publicly declared and signed that we will never start a war, whereas the United States reserves the right to start a war even for a cyber attack. So he said, we felt it necessary to do this because we want to keep the peace. Because the only way we thought we could stop you crazy people from launching a war is for you to know that you were not going to beat us. Now, this is very important background to understand what's going on and the importance of President Trump's decision that the United States should talk to Russia, and the insanity and the evil of people who say we should not. And this came up after the Helsinki summit, which in a delightful, actually, it was very nice to see the CNN reporter, whatever his name is, Anderson Cooper, having his head handed to him by Stephen Cohen, who is a Russia expert at New York University, who would call himself a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. He said, I did not vote for Putin. I mean, I did not vote for Trump. I did not vote for Trump. However, this meeting at Helsinki is very important, and they had this reporter, Max Boot, from the Washington Post, and they had Anderson Cooper, and it was on CNN, and they said, isn't it outrageous that Trump and Putin had a meeting and no one knows what they said? You know, maybe we should waterboard the interpreters. Maybe we should find out. I mean, these are two heads of state. So what Cohen said, he said, well, you know what? I'm a lot older than the two of you. And I can remember a meeting where Gorbachev and Reagan met in 1986, and they met for 2.5 hours. And the press, just like you today, was going bonkers over the fact that the two heads of state had had a private meeting. And they came out of the meeting and they said, we'd like to get rid of nuclear missiles. And their aide said, you can't do that, you can't do that. But what Cohen reminded people is 2.5 months later, there was a whole series of agreements to eliminate certain classes of nuclear missiles. Now, both Putin and Trump, Putin through various intermediaries, because I think he has more success at getting his people to speak on his behalf than President Trump has at getting his people to speak on his behalf. But at any rate, both said that the major issue they wanted to discuss was ending a nuclear arms war. And they wanted to discuss crushing ISIS in Syria. And they wanted to figure out something to be done about Ukraine, which is another giant lie, which Barbara goes through in this article, because Yanukovych and Manafort was involved in this. Yanukovych, the former president, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, was a client of Manafort's. And Yanukovych was overthrown in a violent coup, which was funded with $5 billion from the United States State Department during the Obama administration. A bunch of this money came from George Soros. And this woman, Obama's, I think Victoria Nuland's title was Under Secretary of State for Europe or something like that. But she was over there in the Maidan, in the square, handing out cupcakes and Twinkies to people with Molotov cocktails who were setting the police on fire. So Yanukovych was overthrown. What was brought in were people who had who marched around carrying giant banners and torchlit rallies of Stefan Bandera. That was Adolf Hitler's collaborator in World War II. The Ukrainian Nazis were among the most horrific in terms of what they did to people and how many people they killed and so on. So you had a group of actual Nazis. I mean, literally, some of them, the Azov battalion has swastikas on their uniforms, marching around with photographs of Stepan Bandera. Barack Obama says this is a great democratic movement and supports it. And then what do we get over here? The Russians have invaded Ukraine. Well, what happened? You have Crimea, which was given to Russia, I guess, by Khrushchev in 54, and the whole area. I mean, the history of all of this is much more than the recent. But Crimea is about 90% ethnically Russian. The new regime that comes in, thanks to the Obama administration, and by the way, Christopher Steele, our old friend Christopher Steele, wrote over 100 memos to the US State Department during the time that we were overthrowing this government, probably instructing Victoria Nuland on what to do. So what happens, and there was a horrible bloodbath in Odessa where a group of pro-Russians were protesting, and these neo-Nazis herded them into a building, secured the building, and set the thing on fire and just burned people to death. So what happened in Crimea is they had a referendum. They voted over 95% to leave Ukraine and to rejoin Russia. That's what actually occurred. But what we are getting here in the fake news is that Putin invaded Ukraine. You may notice that they have not shown any video footage on CNN, NBC, or CBS. By the way, who is at CNN now but Brennan? I mean, think about it. We talk about media and other places being controlled. You have the former head of the CIA at CNN. You have Comey's top assistant, or no, is it NBC? It's NBC where I get them mixed up. No, he's at CNN, and then Comey's former guy, Josh Campbell, is at NBC, right? So we have top, not even, I'm sure we have all kinds of secret FBI agents in our media, but you have top people in the FBI in the US news media. I mean, think about it.
Anderson Cooper, too.
And Anderson Cooper and Intelligence. Yeah, so I mean, it's unbelievable. Anyway, so, and now they're going to censor, get rid of Alex Jones and this kind. I mean, you've really got to think about the unbelievable propaganda machine going on here and how they get away. But what I was going to say is if the people of Crimea really didn't want to go back to Russia, don't you think there'd be like out in the streets? Don't you think CNN would be showing us the photographs and the videos of all the poor people in Crimea who really wanted to go back to Ukraine? There are no demonstrations. They don't want to. They don't want to be burned alive for speaking Russian. They went back with Russia because when you have that kind of regime, and what's happened to the economy of Ukraine during this period, it has totally collapsed. Because the whole reason why NATO, Victoria Nuland, wanted to get rid of Yanukovych is they wanted someone in Ukraine who would allow them to loot the country. Because the backdrop of all of this is that the transatlantic financial system is bankrupt. everyone here probably remembers 2008. They called it a mortgage crisis. It was the collapse of what are called actually it was in 2007, the monoline insurers, which insure all these derivatives and things. And you remember perhaps what happened in 2008, which is that a bailout was proposed. $700 billion. W. Bush was president at the time. And the American people jammed the Congress with so many phone calls and emails that their server went down. And I remember seeing congressmen saying that, yeah, I voted against the bailout because I was getting 2,000 calls and emails a day, and half of them were no, and the other half were hell no. I mean, there was no question. What happened? Ben Bernanke comes to the Congress, threatens martial law. There's going to be blood in the streets. You have to do this. Barack Obama, then a U.S. Senator, who was planning to be president, gets on the phone and calls up everyone in the Black Caucus and says, I'm going to be the next president of the United States. If you want to do any work with me, you vote for this bailout. And they rammed the bailout down our throats, and we have since then had trillions and trillions of dollars of quantitative easing. Now, I want to, yes, Lynn's next, right? Yeah. So I want to show you the video. This is a speech that Lyndon, it's just an excerpt. He did a 2.5-hour long webcast in July of 2007. Okay, July of 2007, almost a year and a half before the crash. And I want you to see what he had to say about it. Can we take questions?
Bailouts contrary to the principles of capitalism? Bailouts?
Yes.
It is Florida, right?
Okay, yes. Anyway, here we go. I want you to hear LaRouche.
It occurs at a time where the world monetary financial system is actually now currently in the process of disintegrating. Nothing mysterious about this. I've talked about it for some time. It's been in progress. It's not abating. What's listed as stock values and market values in the financial markets internationally is bunk. These are purely fictitious beliefs. There's no truth to it. The fakery is enormous. There is no possibility of a non-collapse of the present financial system. None. It's finished now. The present financial system cannot continue to exist under any circumstances, under any presidency, under any leadership, or any leadership of nations. Only a fundamental and sudden change in the world monetary financial system will prevent a general, immediate, chain reaction type of collapse. At what speed, we don't know, but they will go on and it will be unstoppable.
Yeah, so how did LaRouche know this? Everyone else said, oh, we're having a recovery. Oh, it's the stock market is so high, things are going great. You heard what he said a year and a half before. Because ever since his, coming back from World War II, working as a management consultant, what he studied was the physical parameters of economy. That is, what are you producing? What is the standard of living? What is the life expectancy? He invented a term which now some economists in Russia are proposing be called the LA, as for LaRouche, which is called potential relative population density. That is, how many people can be sustained in a given area of land comfortably. And you can think about it this way: if you believe that we ever were hunters and gatherers, or supposing human beings had not yet discovered fire and we're just scruffing around in the dirt and eating bugs and grass and stuff like that, probably it would take a very large amount of land to sustain a very small number of people, and they probably would be dead by the time they were 25 or maybe 30. Now, when you figure out how to use fire, when you figure out how to burn wood, suddenly you have the possibility of more people living there and also living longer, having a better life, because by cooking food, you can kill microbes and diseases and so on. If you discover petroleum, in other words, the more dense your form of energy is, the more power you have to transform the land area that you are presented with, which means to cultivate resources, and the more people can be sustained. So what LaRouche developed or discovered as a science of physical economy is this connection between what he would call energy flux density, the amount of energy in a given area, and population density. And you can think at the last minute meeting, I just looked at this because we all hear about the terrible overpopulation on the planet, and then they point at some poor country in Africa which has like 2 people per square mile. Long Island has, I think, 5,200 people per square mile. And if you just extrapolated that to the whole United States, I think it's like 26 billion people or something we could have in the United, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. Now you can argue, well, you know, we don't grow all of our food here, we don't get all of our, okay, so let's say maybe the US should only have 5 billion people. And we could live comfortably and have plenty of farmland. I mean, the whole thing on overpopulation is a total
Agenda
fraud.
21.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah, that's
Right.
a derivative of this. Yeah, so LaRouche debunked this, so he became the most accurate economic forecaster on the planet. He was brought into Ronald Reagan's administration specifically to be Reagan's back channel to the Soviet Union on negotiating the Strategic Defense Initiative, and that was successful. And what happened? Robert Mueller, as Ian already said, Robert Mueller deployed himself to shut down the LaRouche organization. Our newspaper was shut down. About a dozen of my associates went to jail. Margaret Greenspan's brother was given a 77-year jail sentence and was told that if he would just lie and say he was guilty, he wouldn't have to go to jail. And then when he refused, his own lawyer turned against him and said he had to be insane and he wanted a psychiatric evaluation. I mean, we have been through such a fight. So when we see what is being done to Trump by the exact same people who tried to get rid of us, and I think what Giuliani said about Trump, thank God he is so tough, because anyone else would have cracked. You know,
Yeah.
LaRouche didn't crack. LaRouche is 96 years old now and, you know, has been a fighter his entire life, but many people cracked. Many people, at the time they were putting our associates in prison, left this organization. They got scared. They said, we're not gonna do that. But we fought through and persevered, and LaRouche got out of prison and so on. But, I mean, this is a fight. So what are they afraid of? And that is also what Ian got at. Now, I want to shift for a second because there is a terrible collapse here. We have a potential to get out of it because of what President Trump wants to do, if he is allowed to do it, and if we can create a constituency in the United States that understands that most of what everyone here has been taught about economics is completely wrong. And if people can get that idea, then we can have a spectacular recovery here. What I wanted to show you is a little bit about what's going on in other parts of the planet, which the news media will not tell you, because if Americans knew this, they would never be tolerating what Ian described in terms of the collapse that we are experiencing here. So let me just forward a couple
It
things.
occurs that
All right. So, and I'll go one more, just so you, or 2 more. All right, you see Ethiopia, the yellow country over there, just so you have an idea what you're looking at, the Horn of Africa. And what they did to Ethiopia is that little country, Eritrea, was hived off, typical colonial operation, to make Ethiopia landlocked. So there's been a hideous war between Ethiopia and Eritrea that's been going on for decades, a bloody mess. Now, what's happened? The Chinese and the government of Ethiopia completed, I guess about a year ago, a railroad from Djibouti all the way to the inland capital, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. What this has meant, for example, is that the last time there was a horrific drought, and I know many of us, when you hear Ethiopia, you think of starving children with distended bellies and flies swarming, just waiting for them to, I mean, you have this horrible image. Well, the last drought, there wasn't any mass death because they were able to move food and water by rail and reduce the time from days or weeks to hours. And now what is occurring, contrary to the propaganda you hear, because people who have been colonial powers have a hard time imagining that someone doesn't have a colonial interest, say, oh, the Chinese, they're just trying to loot Africa. Oh, the Chinese, they're just, no. And I don't know if it's true in Ethiopia, but in the Kenyan rail, which I have a picture of next, 90% of the workforce was from that country. And they're setting up a school now to train the people of Ethiopia to run this themselves. The Chinese have no interest in running this long term. China does have an interest in Africa, which is that China has a great amount of desert. They don't perhaps have enough arable land, or wouldn't think they do. If Africa is allowed to develop, it can be a food exporting area. They have tremendously rich topsoil and so on. So if you allow these nations to develop, you don't just come in there with your mercenary armies and exterminate everyone and steal the diamonds, but these nations develop, what you have are very beneficial trade relations, which allows the population density of the planet as a whole to increase. One of the things that's so evil about free trade, or about NAFTA, the North American, free trade agreement, if you think in terms of population, potential relative population density, or you think of the ability of your people to be productive, what happens when you take a factory from Detroit, where your workforce is highly educated, has decent health insurance, a high standard of living, and they're producing automobiles in that factory. You take the same factory and you move it to Mexico, where people have no health care, you have 12-year-old labor, you don't have indoor sewage treatment. What do you think happens to the quality of what you produce and to the productivity of the population as a whole? What you're doing with free trade is you are lowering the productivity of the planet as a whole. And some guy who owns the company gets rich for a short time, but you destroy both countries that are involved. So what the Chinese are doing, and they have a very long history, is they are thinking, what is the long-term stable benefit to both? The president of China, Xi Jinping, calls it win-win collaboration, not winner take all. So same thing in Kenya. This is the railroad that's been completed from the port of Mombasa to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. And again, what did the colonial powers, all they did was build railroads from the mines to the ports. There was no intention of developing the inner area of this. Now, interestingly, they just had a conference of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in Johannesburg. President Putin said that he will commit Russia to light up Africa. If you've ever seen a satellite picture of the planet at night, or the dark side, yeah, Africa is dark. You look over the US, you look over Europe, and you see like the east coast of the US is just lights like crazy. Where we have the desert, it's kind of dark, but Africa, the whole continent is dark. So he said he's going to work with the leaders. 30 African heads of state were at that conference. It's a really big deal. They're saying that Ethiopia is going to be the new China of Africa. It has one of the fastest growth rates in the world. Now think about that compared to the New York City subways. I mean, it really is insane. And the New York City rail system, do you know what the average speed of a freight train is across the United States right now?
15.
Close, 21, I heard.
Oh,
Maybe
God.
it's 21. You know what the average speed of a car driving in Manhattan is?
6 miles an hour.
Close, 4.7 miles an hour. You know what the on-time rate of the subway system in New York is right now? 65%. If you have to get to work on time, you cannot rely on the subway. So what do? You get Uber or Lyft or whatever. So these geniuses say, oh, the Uber and Lyft, that's why the city is so congested. No, the city is congested because the public transportation system is completely dysfunctional. So people are forced to go to this other means of getting there. And this is all insane. You realize how insane this is, and we go along and we act like it is normal. I was reading every day this week they've had in the local paper in Northern Jersey articles about New Jersey transit. And they're saying this is the real summer of hell for people in New Jersey. Also because the trains have to have I forget what it's called, fast train something. Anyway, it's a system where you can't have collisions. It has to be installed on every train by December or the trains won't be able to go into Penn Station. Well, guess what? New Jersey's way behind. So it may be the case that none of the New Jersey transit trains are going to be allowed to go to Penn Station if they don't have this thing in.
You think they're doing that on purpose to?
Yeah, they could probably.
There may be some people who are, and some, I'm sorry, but people have become really stupid. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, we had a conversation a couple of years ago, I'll never forget, with a guy who, he was not a stupid person. I think he was a heart surgeon or something. And my friend was talking about the need to get transcontinental railroads built in Africa. He said, oh, you don't need rails. And she said, what do you mean we don't need rail? No, there's a much more efficient way of getting from one place to the next. And she said, what? He said, the internet. I mean, you know, they have 3D plastic printers, but I would not try and get, you know, fettuccine Alfredo out of my printer, and I certainly wouldn't eat it if I could, you know, I mean, so you're dealing with, it really is worth reflecting. And so why is this not in the news? Because Americans would say, if you look at where Ethiopia was in 1980 and where it is today, and you look at the directionality and the pace of development, then people here would never put up with this. And just to give you a sense of how big Africa is, Africa has about 1 billion people now. Soon it'll have 2 billion, and you recognize some of those countries, I hope.
Go up and point, because from way back here you can't see.
What, you can't see?
Well,
Yeah,
show what.
yeah, United.
Yeah, it's got
That's the USA fitting here. This is China, India, that's Eastern Europe, Italy. So you can fit inside Africa, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the US without Alaska, China, India, Great Britain, Japan.
So we don't need Agenda 21?
Right, not at all, not at all.
It's a sad, scary thing.
Now,
that's
the other
happening.
thing I want to show you is what China is doing. This bridge, the Donghai Bridge, was completed, I guess, in 2005. They just built another one, which I always forget the name of,
That bridge is amazing.
which is even bigger than this. But this bridge is 20 miles long. And contrary to also, again, what you hear, the Chinese, actually, there's a wonderful 30-minute video about the railroad that they built in Kenya, because they take such great pains to protect the wildlife that they put in one area where they know they have elephants going back and forth in Kenya, they put the railroad up on these, you know, stilts, and they tested it. They actually built a model to see whether the animals would go underneath it or not, and then they built it that way. So part of the reason for this curving around is land, but it's also concern for, you know, whatever environmental considerations they had to take into account. And the speed at which they build these things is amazing. And I think the next thing, hopefully, is a video. Is this the train station?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a train station, which wasn't actually a whole, people quickly got, it wasn't a whole station. Anyway, switched a train station from 2 tracks to 3 tracks with a switching station and so on. They built the whole thing in 9 hours with 1,500 people working in 7 teams of, anyway, so just watch it, it's really fun.
Read the text.
分了7个工作面，同步推进施工。
So anyway, now one of my good friends,
Como supervised them.
you said Cuomo probably supervised. One of my friends who works at the American Society of Civil Engineers said, it's not really fair to say 9 hours because, of course, to do that, how many hours of planning, right?
Sure.
But our people are qualified. Think about when Kennedy said we're going to put a man on the moon within this decade, and especially after the first Apollo 1 with that horrible explosion in the simulation, and then Kennedy's assassination. People like Gene Kranz at Mission Control really got a fire in the belly that they were going to do this, and we were going to have the best safety record, and we were going to do it in record time. And you think about what we were capable of doing. So again, I would just say that's why this is not in the news. What would the suicide rate be in this country if children knew that they were going to be in a world that was vastly improved from how they're living today? What would be the drug addiction? Who would want to be on, you see those things that the machines they were using, can you do that when you're on pot?
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, the whole culture would be different. So I'm going to tell you, LaRouche wrote this paper on tariffs and trade, and I'm sorry because I'm maybe talking too long, but and we'll get to Shakespeare, but I just want to give you a sense of this. He says, and this paper was from 2004, today's typical U.S. citizen, whether of high or low academic ranking, is like one of a swarm of captive fish in a goldfish bowl. A bowl which itself is being carried presently toward the financial cultural toilet, where the contents of the fishbowl might be dumped. The bowl which imprisons those captives so is a delusion concerning the nature of both economy in general and money in particular. That citizen is a victim of belief in a set of axiom-like assumptions which are false to reality, like the dogma known as free trade, a dogma in which he believes more or less devoutly. The trouble is, the typical citizen views the opinions he or she derives from such axiom-like assumptions as practical. He or she, therefore, considers opinions contrary to these assumptions as impractical, only theoretical, or perhaps what the sick-minded existentialist of today derides as conspiracy theories. So, the unwitting citizen's mind is imprisoned within a goldfish bowl-like wall in which that mind swims as if refusing to accept the notion that anything really exists outside that wall, or even that the wall itself exists. Such a citizen within his bowl of self-delusion becomes thus comparable to the legendary lemming running over the edge of the cliff to the rocks below for the sake of party unity, because he rejects the notion that it were socially unacceptable to act differently. However, usually the man in the goldfish bowl does not actually run over the cliffs. Rather, he lets his bowl of delusion carry him to his doom as if spontaneously. So, the world's most productive economy of 1963 has been transformed over 40, and now it's 50, intervening years into the disaster which acquired habit has produced for today. Now, we're going to get to Hamlet, and I thought we would start. How many people here have a vague remembrance of the plot of Hamlet? Okay, some of you. Yeah, anyone want to say a little bit about what you remember about it? No volunteers?
He
What?
wants to usurp the
How
king
about
and
when
become
he,
the king of,
when he
what is it,
dug,
Denmark?
he was in the cemetery?
When he was in the cemetery?
Yeah, and he dug up the skull.
Yeah, he didn't dig
Yeah,
up the
he didn't-
grave
he was,
diggers threw
grave
up the skull.
diggers dug
Yeah,
up.
you know,
Yeah.
so bits and pieces.
Right, come
Yeah.
back.
Well, let's take a look. I'm going to read the soliloquy, which we're all going to read it. I hope you all have it. We're going to do group reading here. Do you all have it?
Yes.
To be or not, doesn't everyone? The Shakespeare's language is so beautiful. We should all have a chance to read it together, even though we can't do it super poetically because we're doing it together. But this is from Act 3 later on, but just let's read it first, and then we'll get to the rest of it. So you ready?
Right.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you.
To be or not to be? Come on, everybody, read out. That is the
That is the
question.
question.
Whether 'tis
Whether 'tis
nobler in the mind
mind
to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than flies to others we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. So what is he saying?
No idea.
It's something about taking a chance, having faith, to take a chance to resist, revolt against all the miserable ways the world is working, and yet being exposed to the slings and arrows and so on, or to bear the miseries as a better lot, than taking that step into the unknown.
That's something, right. He says, no, we don't know what happened after death, and there's more. LaRouche will say more, but I just want you to begin thinking about this. What is he saying? Enter is sicklied over, right? The native hue of resolution. We're resolved. We have a resolution to do something. And then he's saying, oh, not sure. Yeah,
Could this be like the Revolutionary War? Like,
sure.
This is,
Sure, you could have think if George Washington was like Hamlet.
Yeah, well, in that case, yeah.
We would still be under the
that's what
British.
the whole thing is, and
Yeah.
that, they had this back then where they couldn't fight, and here we did it, and we're still fighting.
The unthinkable is to revolt
Never
against
stops.
King.
Never stopped,
So
we never
powerful.
stopped.
Yes, it's interesting, and you'll see more. So here's the quandary of Hamlet, but it's more, and Shakespeare really draws it out. Now, I'm going to go, and Ian, you have it? Do you have your part? I gave it to you at the beginning, because I wanted you and Margaret to do some reading. In Act 1, Scene 1, which is actually in the cemetery, and there's guards, and Horatio, who is Hamlet's best friend, speaks, and then Marcellus, who's one of the guards. Margaret, oh, she can't do it. All right, I'm going to do Marcellus, and Ian's going to be Horatio.
What am I?
You're going to do it good. So Margaret's going to be Marcellus, Ian is Horatio, and they're speculating, why are there all these guards everywhere, and why does everyone seem to be getting...
Make sure they do it up here so I can get in.
Oh, come up here by the microphone, you two. And why is everyone seeming to prepare for war? Okay. This is safe readings.
Yes. In what particular thought to work, I know not, but in the gross and scope of my opinion, this bodes some strange eruption to our state.
Good now, sit down and tell me, he that knows, why this same strict and most observant watch so nightly toils the subject of the land, and why such daily cast of brazen cannon and foreign mart for implements of war, why such impress of shipwrights, whose sore task does not divide the Sunday from the week. What might be toward that this sweaty haste doth make the night joint laborer with the day? Who is it that can inform me?
That can I. At least the whisper goes so. Our last king, whose image even but now appeared to us, was, as you know, by Fortinbras of Norway, thereto pricked on by a most emulate pride, dared to the combat, in which our valiant Hamlet, for so this side of our known world esteemed him, did slay this Fortinbras, who, by a sealed compact, well ratified by law and heraldry, did forfeit with his life all those his lands which he stood seized of to the conqueror. Against the which a moiety compliment was gauged by our king, which had returned to the inheritance of Fortinbras. Had he been vanquisher, as by the same covenant and carriage of the article designed, his fell to Hamlet. Now, sir, young Fortinbras, of unimproved metal, hot and full, hath in the skirts of Norway here and there sharped up a list of lawless resolutes for food and diet to some enterprise that hath stomach in it, which is no other, as it doth well appear unto our state, but to recover of us by strong hand and terms compulsory, those foresaid lands, so by his father lost. And this, I take it, is the main motive of our preparations, the source of this our watch, and the chief head of this post-haste and rummage in the land.
Okay, that's it.
A little louder.
Oh, maybe we'll put the speaker up next time. So, could people catch what's happening there? Hamlet Sr. decided to get into a war with Fortinbras of Norway, killed him, and Fortinbras therefore had to forfeit all of his lands, which Denmark now controls. And what Horatio was saying is that if if Hamlet had died, then it would have been the same the other way. In other words, whoever died was going to lose their land and lose their kingdom. So the son of Fortinbras is now rounding up all these ruffians, they call them landless, whatever. He's rounding up a whole gang to come and invade Denmark and take back everything that his father lost. Fortinbras, right? So anyway, that's the scene, right? So the son of the guy who was killed by Hamlet's father is rounding up all these rebels to come and invade and take back everything that they lost. And Hamlet's father has died, and Hamlet is very disturbed. He was away at school in Germany. And this is very, very important to think of Shakespeare. You know, Abraham Lincoln used to read Shakespeare to his troops, to his cabinet. Unfortunately, he was assassinated at the theater. He was an avid lover of classical drama for the reasons that we're going to see with what Shakespeare did in this play. At any rate, so Hamlet is away in Germany and he gets word that his father has died. So he rushes to get back to Denmark, and he gets there and his mother is already marrying his uncle. So he's saying, couldn't she have waited? I mean, it only took me a few weeks to get home, and now she's already marrying my father's brother, and he's a little suspicious about all this. So then what happens is that this ghost of his father has been appearing at the graveyard at night, and Horatio and Marcellus tell Hamlet, there's the ghost, we think it's your father, and we tried to talk to it, wouldn't say anything. Do you want to come with us and see if you can talk to it? So Hamlet goes with them, and the ghost appears, and Hamlet runs after, and they're all terrified. They say, what if the ghost is going to lead you off a cliff or something? He says, no, I have to talk to him, I have to talk to him. So the ghost, you want to be the ghost? You be the ghost and I'll be Hamlet. Hamlet only has a few little short interjections.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast in fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. But that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thy two eyes like stars start from their spheres, thy knotted and combined locks to part, and each particular hair to stand on end, like quills upon the fretful porpentine. But this eternal blazon must not be to ears of flesh and blood. List, list, oh list, if thou didst ever thy dear father love.
Oh God!
Revenge his foul and most unnatural murder.
Murder?
Murder most foul, as in the best it is. But this most foul, strange, and unnatural.
Haste me to know it, that I, with wings as swift as meditation or the thoughts of love, may sweep to my revenge.
I find thee apt, and duller shouldst thou be than the fat weed that roots itself in ease on the left wharf. Wouldst thou not stir in this? Now, Hamlet, hear. 'Tis given out that, sleeping in my orchard, a serpent stung me. So the whole ear of Denmark is, by a forged process of my death, rankly abused. But know, thou noble youth, the serpent that did sting thy father's life now wears his crown.
Okay, you got it? So what did the ghost just tell him? Right, the brother killed him. And then the ghost goes on and recounts the whole story of how I was lying in the orchard, as I often do, and my brother came and put poison in my ear and killed me. And then very quickly he pursued the queen and married her, and he said, please don't blame your mother. she was devastated and she was weak, it's not her fault, but this is what happened. So what do you think the impact of hearing this is on a young, fiery warrior like Hamlet? He wants revenge, and what he does is he tries to set up a trap by having a fake play done. He writes a play where he shows someone coming and killing the king, and then his uncle jumps up and storms out of the theater. He says, "I got him," and that's where he makes the soliloquy where he says, "To be or not to be," because he's created the scene where the whole thing unfolds, and he says, "Okay, will I now avenge the death of my father?" And he can't. Okay, so this is going on. Now, meanwhile, and I'll skip this reading, but what happens is ambassadors come in from Norway, and it turns out that King Claudius, Hamlet's uncle, has sent ambassadors because he fears that Fortinbras Jr. is making preparations to invade Denmark and take back everything that his father lost. So Fortinbras Jr. is not the king. His uncle has become the king, who is a bedridden, very sick, and he's just ill and weak. So they send ambassadors and say, "Hey, Fortinbras is getting ready to invade us. What are you going to do?" So they send the ambassadors back and they say, "Oh, well, we thought Fortinbras was just on his way to invade Poland." I want my map back. Sorry. Just so you can see Poland, right? So it's Norway to Denmark to Poland. So the old feeble sick guy in Norway says, "Oh no, he's not going to invade Denmark. He's just getting ready to invade Poland." So Claudius says, no, we think he's going to invade Denmark. So the ambassadors come back and they say, "You know what, you were right. We discovered that he was planning to invade Denmark, but I have reprimanded him and told him, don't invade Denmark to avenge your father," and he agreed, and so he's really just going to be passing through Denmark to get to Poland. Does that seem credible to you? The young man whose father is killed, who lost all of his land, is just going to quietly pass through Denmark to make his way to invade Poland. And what does King Claudius say? He says, "Oh, this is such wonderful news. We can relax. We don't have to worry about this anymore." And so they don't worry about it anymore. So what happens then is Hamlet, there's a whole series of things. Hamlet is acting crazy. The queen, his mother, and Claudius decide that he's really nuts and that he might be in love with Ophelia and so on. They try to send him to England, and they send a note with him to England that says, "When he arrives, please kill him on our behalf." And Hamlet discovers the note, and he gives it to his friends, the actors who did this play on his behalf. So the actors carry the note and go to England. Hamlet doesn't, and they get killed when they get there because they're carrying the note that says they should be killed. So what ends up occurring in all of this is a whole bunch of mistaken identities. Hamlet thinks he's killing someone, and he stabs behind the curtain and kills someone else. Then the king decides, Claudius decides that he has to kill Hamlet. Ophelia dies she goes insane and basically drowns herself because Hamlet seemed to be in love with her, and then he's no longer in love with her because he's so obsessed about what happened to his mother and his father that he's completely obsessed and acting crazy. So Ophelia kills herself. Her brother gets in a duel with Hamlet. The king decides they should have a duel. Then Claudius prepares a cup of poison for Hamlet. And at the end, also they poison the tip of the sword to make sure Hamlet gets killed. But what happens is they switch swords, so Hamlet kills the other guy. The queen drinks the poison, so she dies. Then Hamlet gets killed and he dies. Then Claudius dies. And then at that moment, Prince Fortinbras arrives in Denmark. And isn't that interesting? Because everyone is dead, and he is made the heir then to all of the lands that he could have taken. So what is Shakespeare's point? And I'll tell you, when you go online, as I was reading this, and you get like the Cliff Notes version, they say, well, this Fortinbras Norway thing is really a subplot, because the real plot is about, did Hamlet's uncle kill his father? That's the real story here. What does that have to do with what's going on today? Right? You have a guy, your kingdom is about to be destroyed, and he is completely diverted in madness and thinks that this is the only thing at issue, and everyone is flawed. Is Claudius any better than Hamlet, his uncle who committed this crime? No. The ambassadors come back from Norway and say, oh, don't worry, young Fortinbras is just going to merrily pass through Denmark on his way to Poland. There'll never be a war, you know. And the king says, oh, that's great, because I'm really having a great honeymoon with my new wife, and I really didn't want to have to worry about it. So what you see is that every character, except at the end, Horatio, who is acting like chorus, like a Greek chorus, Hamlet's friend who tells you what's going on, at the end of the play, Horatio says, oh, and then the first ambassador also says, we just came back from England, and we really wanted to tell the king that we carried out his wishes, and we killed the two actors. So, I mean, in other words, everybody's wrong about everything. They're all going on sense perception, things as it's presented. So the ambassador's coming back to say, hey, we killed the two guys you told us to kill, except the king had really told them to kill Hamlet, so they killed the wrong people. But it's all based on appearances. So everyone's acting according to what's in front of their nose and not thinking about what's actually happening. And Fortinbras, and then the first ambassador says, well, where should we get our thanks for killing the people the king wanted us to kill? And Horatio says, not from his mouth. Had it the ability of life to thank you, he never gave the commandment for their death. But since so jump upon this bloody question, you from Polack wars to Fortinbras, and you from England to the ambassadors, are here arrived, give order that these bodies high on a stage be placed to view, that is the bodies of everyone who just killed each other, and let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot purposes mistook, fallen on the inventor's reeds. All this I can truly deliver. So Horatio is saying, why don't you put all these bodies on display and let people think about how this came to pass, that every single person ended up dead. And maybe people will not make the same mistakes. And if you know anything about warfare or famous battles, this is everything. General Grant describes in his memoirs a moment where he had to lead troops up over a hill, and the Confederate army was down below, and he was, or it may have been the Mexican War, I'm not sure, but anyway, he was completely terrified because he just knew when they came over the crest of the hill, it could be that what kind of fight they would have to fight. They get to the top of the hill, they look down, and there's a little bit of smoke. The fires have been put out and everyone has fled. But in other words, so there's a certain kind of strategy which is beyond what you perceive with your senses. Now, I want to close just telling you what LaRouche had to say about this Hamlet thing, because he uses the Hamlet soliloquy in his paper about 2004. And he says, Hamlet, the killer swordsman, is not frightened by dying, but by what might come after his death. So he dies as a pathetic fool, taking his kingdom to disaster with him, not for fear of death, but fear of immortality. What is tragedy? It is failure to meet the challenge of the future. It is the failure to bring forth today that which the small mind deems a seemingly impractical action, but an action on which the possibility of existence of an acceptable tomorrow depends. The moral and immortal function of the mortal human individual is not to do what is expected, but to perform that unexpected action which contributes to pushing the universe a notch upward, at least by a nudge or two, of making the universe a notch newer and better than it was. So that's what I have. So now, if you have questions or thoughts, or I think this should be a little bit provocative, because we are, yeah.
Yeah, before when you spoke about that defense system that Russia came out with, you know, the Chinese have the same thing.
I know they're working on it, I don't know for sure that they do. but-
And between, there has been a dispute in Southeast Asia since the early 50s with an island off the coast of Vietnam. You probably heard about it. And the Philippines claims asylum, Vietnam claims asylum, and the Chinese claim asylum because it's supposed to be so robust and of natural resources like oil and gas. And about a year ago, the Chinese in another island supposedly built this island as a defense system in order to, if they felt they weren't going to be treated fairly, and they wouldn't be able to get a hold of this island, which it would be a strategic mistake because it's really closer to China and Vietnam compared to the Philippines. And they found that the Chinese have these same weapons. They were working on them about the same time that the Russians, you know, started working on them.
What is the point you're trying to make?
The point that I'm making at, if they deploy these weapons on that island, okay, certain holes that we have in Southeast Asia could be devastating to us.
Right, excepting they have no intention of doing that.
No, they don't. But when you have influence from another country, like let's take Great Britain, for instance, the way they're right now, economic problems are down. They would do anything to try to help their government build up again. When you have a country like that involved, I consider them like an antagonizer, all right? Where when you, at one point, the United States sided with Great Britain because they said that a spy that went to live in England was assassinated by the Russians, all right? I sent time that I don't believe that.
Right.
All right? I believe the English did it to them
Right.
themselves. So when you have a
I think
country
you're
like
right.
this was the country, England, now to get to my point, were the ones who informed the United States that the Chinese were working on the same weapons, only they were going to deploy them on another island. So to me, it's like England's 200 years backwards, and you're still doing the same things over again.
Well, that's very accurate.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, you're referring to, there's actually a couple of cases. There's, what was the name of the guy who was killed before, earlier? I'm blocking his name, and then you had the
Yeah.
Skripals, but the
Right.
guy before who was killed that they tried to blame on Putin.
Oh,
Right.
yeah. I can't.
He
On
was
the
a
bridge.
journalist or something,
Yeah.
in,
Well,
yeah, anyway,
The
and
country's in such a mess.
his family said that Putin did not do it. And then you had the Skripal case where they claimed Novichok, which a Swiss chemical weapons lab said it was not Novichok, it was something that only NATO countries have access
Right.
to. And somehow the house, which supposedly had Novichok in it, was allowed to be visited and sealed up, and the 2 guinea pigs starved to death and a cat died
Sure.
of dehydration. In other words, there was
No.
the whole thing was a complete fraud, exactly. But,
Were you ever to England? When was, have you been to England?
yeah,
When was the last time you were there?
long ago,
All right.
longer than
Try-
I'd care to say.
Try going now. The country's in such a mess. When Trump was running for election, the mayor of England at that time.
Of London, you mean?
Of London, the mayor of London at that time said, well, you know, if Trump is elected, if he ever comes into, to London, I'll have him arrested. All right? And, she was throwing so much heat on the system. Like, when does one country have the right to interfere with another person's election? England did more interfering in his election than any
Well,
other
that's
country.
the point exactly of what Ian was
Yeah.
getting at in terms of what's coming to
You know,
light
when I was in
now.
when I was in London, there's a town, it used to be a thriving city. What they used to do, they used to build steel frames there, and they used to build the frames for large ships. It was called the Iron and Steel Works. Right now, the Iron and Steel Works don't exist anymore. That was like 35% of the economy in Great Britain, up until about 20 years ago.
Right.
Right
Can
now.
I say something?
Yeah,
Because, I mean, if you think about what happened with the Brexit vote, that
Right.
was a rejection, just like the Trump election was a rejection of
Sure.
politics as usual and Wall Street and war, which is what Hillary Clinton represented. What happened with the Brexit vote was the same thing. And there's actually a useful document. I mean, this, by the way, is one of the things for which LaRouche was blamed nonstop, because we've been going after the British and identifying the British.
right.
And everyone said, oh, LaRouche says the Queen of England pushes drugs. We said, no, she just pushes dopes.
Yeah.
Like
Well, you
Tony
know,
Blair and
the thing
others.
is,
But let me
like,
finish.
yeah.
But see, there's a revolution going on, and that's the problem that they have, is what you're alluding to. Their system
Right.
is done. The bailout that was begun in 2008 is now a bubble which is far larger than the one that imploded at that time. And one thing actually that Mr. LaRouche and his wife are concerned about is that these people could pull the plug on this bubble in time for the November midterm elections, for
Sure.
example, as a way of trying to get a Congress that will impeach the president.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's what
Which
they're
is-
trying to do.
Yeah, and they would go that far, because their bubble's gonna implode anywhere. All that they care is that they're on top of the rubble heap, right?
They're already on top, they're
Well, they're
safe.
not,
Well,
they're
you see-
under it, because there's a new dynamic with what China is. See, we don't have a sense here, because in the United States, we are used to thinking of ourselves as being the most powerful nation on the planet. And in some ways we are, and our participation against the British is really crucial. But on the other hand, if you look at, you now have China and Russia working very closely together. You have 140 nations involved in this Belt and Road. So what you have is 2/3 of the world population is already out of this bankrupt system. And therefore, yeah, and so they have a different approach. In other words, it's very like Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I would say this is because Trump is president, just signed a peace treaty.
Like, I don't know much about this, but like, is Trump trying to get rid of the Federal Reserve like, the other president, Kennedy? wanted to do it. Is
I
that
wouldn't
gonna
put
help-
it that
is
way,
gonna help
but
the whole
Trump did
problem?
call for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall when he was a candidate.
Say that again?
Trump called for the reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act when he was president. Glass-Steagall being the separation of the banks, where you put up the firewall between normal savings and loan commercial banks, and the investment banks have to be totally separate. That was taken down in 1999 on orders of Alan Greenspan during the Clinton presidency.
Is that a good thing or
A
bad thing?
terrible thing, because what it meant was that these banks could then unload their gambling debts, like when they sold off all these fake mortgages and let you buy into it mortgage-backed securities and all this collapsed. That meant that a legitimate bank could use your savings account as, that's right, as collateral for their crazy activity.
Okay.
That's how they did the bailout. If you put Glass-Steagall back, then you're saying, no, the taxpayers are not obligated to bail out your crazy gambling.
Yeah, I did not know anything about it, but that's insane, yeah.
Of course, and so Trump had called for reinstating Glass-Steagall, but
When did he do
Mnuchin,
that?
when he was a candidate, when he was campaigning.
Do you think he's gonna try to do that?
I think he wants to do it, but again, this is an administration that is completely beleaguered, under siege. I don't know, do you want to say anything, Ian, about any of this right
It's
now?
completely,
Okay, let me know.
it's completely, I mean.
Right, so you have
And I don't even
Mnuchin.
know if I'm getting the right information even on the internet about, you know what I mean? I'm
Right.
like, I can get so
You're
many,
not.
I don't even know if.
No, but that's why we all
So
have to study
confused.
Shakespeare. I mean, that's, no,
Yeah.
really, because
No, you're
You
right.
know-
he's such a genius, and how, if you were Hamlet, right, if you were Hamlet in this mess, and you suddenly come home from school and your father's dead and your mother's married your uncle, how the hell do you figure out what the truth of the matter is?
Right?
And you have to be responsible for kind of getting your own bearings and say, well,
So back then was insane, it's insane now. I mean, I woke up like 2 years ago, I just couldn't believe what was going on.
That's
Well,
why
I'm
we
in
went out
Washington.
We need to wake
I'm in
everybody up.
Washington every
right,
other
and
week.
that's why we're publishing, you know, as we are, and why we're out on the streets and doing everything we can.
It's scary because people want to kill you, I feel like it's a communist.
Well, some of them, but not,
You know,
no.
they.
No,
it's
don't forget that
blamed on
Trump
Russia, but
won.
you can't. They're not the ones doing
Yeah,
it.
but also don't forget that Trump
I'm afraid
won.
to wear the hat, they're making me afraid to do that.
Yeah, well, Maxine Waters with her psycho comments
Oh, yeah,
contributed
did
to
you hear the
that.
latest? She wants
Basically
another
urging-
revolution?
Yeah, but don't people see
That's
this
why
is
what we're doing
Yeah.
on the street is so important. That's
Right.
why supporting this movement is so important. We're the only ones holding meetings publicly and standing on the street corner saying, come out and defend your president. We gave you the opportunity to sit in a room with 30 other people, or however many, 10, 15, 20. We do it every week in Manhattan.
Yes,
We do
what
this on the
Dominic has a
streets.
question.
Thank you. What is this intense hatred of Trump? It started when he was elected, and it's just kind of carried on and on and on, and they're persistent. I'm hearing things over the radio, they want to impeach him, they want to get a group together. What's going on here?
No, because it's, and Ian said this in the beginning when he talked about the oligarchy or their view of man. If the United States, Russia and China and India get together, where is the British Empire? In other words, the
Right.
US, Russia, China, India, nobody can beat that. That is
So
a
that's the-
totally
that's
new
the ticket,
dynamic.
that's- okay,
Well,
I
think
didn't know
about,
that.
because there are various things that Trump is doing, like some of the tariffs, which I don't think are the right policy. But they're not attacking him for that. What are they attacking him
That's
for?
why
How
somebody-
dare you talk to Putin? How dare you talk? In other words, they're attacking him for the things that are the most important because they will transform the entire planet.
I'd like to
What?
say one more thing.
Okay.
The tariffs are important, all right, to some
No, we
respect.
should have tariffs.
That's right.
But you
But you have to
gotta have
understand-
Glass-Steagall in place. See,
Right.
if we have a psycho banking system where you're just printing money hand
Oh,
over
of course.
fist, then you,
But you have to remember, some countries got away with a free ride for years.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Look at England, look at
Well,
France.
sure.
That's true.
Right?
yeah.
They got away with a free ride, right?
No,
What do
the
you make?
countries
The
have a
France got
right.
smart, and they said, you know, this is,
No,
after they
nations
had the
have a
terrorist
right to
problems, yeah.
protect their industry. There's a very specific reason for
Right.
tariffs, because you want to allow certain key components. LaRouche used to talk about a full set economy. Like every nation should be self-sufficient in food production,
Yes.
self-sufficient in energy production. It is a proper use of tariffs to protect those industries so that your nation can develop these things. And what was done under the World Trade Organization, for example, is you had nations like Haiti, Egypt, and others which were self-sufficient in food. And the World Trade Organization came in and said, oh, no, 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 you should be exporting coffee and cocoa, and you should buy, like the US,
That's right.
we're buying vegetables from Mexico and
Right.
beef from Argentina.
the
And
only
we're
crop we have is
exporting
corn and wheat. That's it.
ethanol
It's like-
to China. I mean, it's all psychotic. And it destroys the quality of your food because it's old and you have to do all kinds of weird things to it to make it last long enough.
Right.
You know, I just got a bunch of apples somewhere and I thought they were really sour. And I don't know if they just painted them red because they weren't really ripe, but God knows where they sent them from to get them
Or
there.
New York State
Right.
They
apples,
actually inject
Okay.
they inject grapefruit to be pink. They do that. They do a lot
Yeah,
of that.
so imagine, wouldn't it make more sense for your food to be largely locally grown? And if we develop, you know, like the Chinese are experimenting, and I know Musk talks about a hyperloop, but if you have a magnetically levitated rail inside a vacuum tube, they did a test, you can go 750 miles an
Yes.
hour, but they think it
Right.
would exceed 1,000 miles an hour.
But they have that.
So great, but when you have,
Yeah,
when you can move at 1,000 miles an hour and you want to get a really exotic something or other from somewhere, then you can get it, and you should pay a lot for it, right? As opposed to suppressing the wages and the standard of living to get things that are cheap and also are disease infested and spoil and aren't ripe when you get them. Yeah.
China, why is Trump, to me, seeming, even though he had a very nice meeting with him last year, why does he seem like to be putting tariffs on China so harsh in front of him?
That's a very good question, and there's two parts to that. One is that we see repeatedly, and people in Asia are often saying to their colleagues, you have to distinguish between Trump and other people in his administration, because there are people trying very hard, for example, to destroy Trump's work with North Korea. Like, think about people saying,
Right.
well, we're going to give them the Libya treatment. Well, Gaddafi was sodomized and murdered in the streets. You really want to say that going into negotiations? That is very irresponsible or destructive. So you have a problem of people saying things that don't represent Trump's view. You also have Trump's particular way of negotiating, which is that he likes to smash everything from the beginning and then come in and he runs it, and it's a reasonable
He's smart
policy.
enough. He's
Yeah.
smart enough. We
And,
would all get rid of all
right,
these people.
and then you
so-
also have people lying straight out. For example, we actually got the video of the business meeting where Trump spoke, and what he said in his comments was quite conciliatory and still how much he valued his relationship with Xi Jinping, but the news media said he said something totally else, which he didn't even say at all,
Yeah,
right? So that's, you know, what
we
you're
have to
dealing with.
somehow, I think, take over those media.
I
That's
agree.
the
I
number
actually
one.
think we should shut down CNN.
Right.
Hey,
We
man.
really should. We should shut
Amen.
them down.
Everybody here should subscribe to EIR Magazine and get our
Right.
emails every day, because we have been driven for 50 years. Mr. LaRouche served in prison for 5 of those years.
He was.
To defy the media that was brainwashing the population of both parties. He's been against the party system all of
I've
his life.
seen
as
friends
George
of mine
Washington.
literally melt down and say, when are they gonna impeach him? Like, and they're not friends of mine anymore, but I'm like, and it's, I think the TV, they're putting out.
No, that's why I'm
subliminal
saying
things
we
that
should
make them
shut down
crazy.
CNN, because they are psycho. I was with my aunt
Yes.
the other day, and she gets, her phone starts binging. Bing! What is it? President Trump is going to kill all the endangered species. And then you're still like, bing! President Trump is brutalizing 4-year-olds. Bing! President, I mean, and you're just bombarded with this, and they're going crazy.
TV show, The View.
Yeah, I would
But they-
suggest.
Anyway, Dominic had a question.
Thank you
What?
very much.
Yeah.
to criticize dialogue with Putin, Russia, to criticize dialogue with China, to criticize dialogue with North Korea. I understand many of these politicians want to take a strong stance and a strong front, which Trump is noted for. So to criticize, these are major players in the world. Are we going to isolate ourselves beyond ourselves and create a super nation? No, it's up to you have to relate with these other powers. So to criticize dialogue with them is just wrong.
Actually, what you're saying reminds me of I told you about Stephen Cohen, this Russian professor on CNN, and it was really funny because the Washington Post reporter was like frothing at the mouth to Cohen. But President Trump, he threatened North Korea, he's threatening Iran. Why doesn't he threaten Russia? And Cohen says, you want the president to threaten Russia? With what? What are you proposing and for what? And they say, well, the Russians interfered in our elections. And Cohen said, well,
that was never
let me
proven.
give you, no, that was never proven. And what Cohen does, though, is hilarious because he goes through, starting from the Russian Revolution, how the U.S. and Russia have always meddled in everybody's elections as much as they could get away with, and this really is nothing new. And then what Cohen finally says, which is hilarious, he said, you know, I'm thinking the two of you would have only approved of this meeting if President Trump had waterboarded Putin at Helsinki. I mean, it was just crazy. All right, this, you and then you. Yeah.
Since World War II, America has been the leader of the world, like it or not. And because with leadership goes responsibility, and with responsibilities, they behaved onto these president to have a dialogue with these other nations. Even though not popular, not liked, we know they're not our friends, but you have to have dialogue with these nations.
Right. Well, I wouldn't even assume they're not our friends, but anyway.
No,
what
wait,
were you going to
okay.
say? Go ahead.
Do you really think that the Governor Cuomo was really brave enough to run for president in
No.
2020?
I
No,
think,
so-
I don't know, he's obviously playing with it. I don't know. It's
Yeah,
like,
It's a big game on TV every time I
Right.
hear him. And,
no, it could be, it could be.
No.
I would just say, and I think we're going to end this and we can talk separately and people should, you know, visit our literature table and so on. But we have 90 days. There are two people right now who are very closely associated with LaRouche who are running for Congress to intervene. One is Ron Wieczorek, who's he's a farmer in South Dakota, who is very well known out there. He's really taking the state by storm, and he and his wife are like a two-man they're just great. And then in Houston, a young woman who's a very good friend of mine named Keisha Rogers, who's African American. She ran for Congress twice in Democratic primaries in 2010 and 2012, and then 2014 she ran for U.S. Senate. Now what she did, and think about this, as a young black woman in 2010, she ran for the Democratic Party nomination on a platform of impeaching Obama.
Oh.
And to the great hysterical dismay of the party, she won the nomination. She did not win the election. They were so freaked out. And then she won it again 2 years later to demonstrate this was no mistake. She also is a huge champion of NASA and the space program.
What state is she in?
Texas, the ninth CD in Texas. She put out a statement, which people should get here, which calls replace NAFTA with NABRI, the North American Belt and Road Initiative. She is running against Al Green. Do people know who?
Republican or Democrat?
She's an independent.
Right.
She's an independent. And do people know who Al Green is?
No.
He's the member of the Black Caucus with a ponytail who jumps up at every opportunity and tries to impeach Trump. So Keisha, and the district that she's running in is very, very poor. It's African American, Hispanic, and Vietnamese American, suburb of Houston. This congressman is super rich. And as Keisha went around to talk to people and to get signatures to get on the ballot, a lot of people didn't want to, first they didn't want to sign, they were so disgusted, and then someone say, oh, you're Keisha, you're in my neighborhood. Al Green has never come here before. He has never set foot here. And when she went to the American Legion post or some particular veterans thing to speak, the head of the post said, you know, I really thought you weren't going to show up. Because the congressman never shows up when he says he's going to. So her race, I think, is very, very interesting and promising in Texas. And of course, defeating someone who has made himself the point man for the impeachment of Trump would be very important. But I say that to say that, as I was mentioning about the possibility of a financial blowout before the elections, we have basically 90 days to break the back of this attempted coup. And you have some things now coming out in the Congress which are very useful, because they want to pursue Christopher Steele. They want to pursue the British role. What Giuliani said is absolutely right, that the big crime that was committed is what Mueller, Obama, Susan Rice, and Christopher Steele have done, and it does go right to London. And if people will have the guts, if they won't be like Hamlet, if they will have the guts to follow through on this, this will be huge, and it could be the break point for the United States to finally be liberated. Because think about why all your friends, when Judy, Ian, others of us are out at our little literature tables, you can't imagine the number of people, especially in Manhattan or some liberal areas, people who come over and they say, I'm the only one in my neighborhood. They're not the only one, but because no one dares to talk about it because of the environment that's been created, people don't dare to express their support. Yeah.
You know, they made
Yeah.
it like that, and
What?
they had the news media on their side.
The man in front
Yes,
of us wants to speak.
Joseph
Everything.
McGowan wants to say,
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
I wear this hat all over Long Island. I wear it every
Yes.
day. I have 3 hats. I wear it every day.
Nobody's
Nobody, but nobody will stop me. I had one little young black girl in the mall, didn't know any better. And she wanted to start a confrontation. I said, honey, it's very simple. It's a question of mind over matter. I don't mind, and you don't matter. I walked away.
Very good, that's a good note. So let's end, please see the literature table, sign up and get our material.
Thank you.
You're welcome.